By the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific had shifted into a dangerous and uncertain phase. Just months earlier, the Japanese Empire had launched a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling much of the United States Pacific Fleet and forcing America into a war it had not fully prepared for. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces moved rapidly across the Pacific, capturing key territories, including the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. Their expansion seemed unstoppable. With a powerful navy, experienced pilots, and a clear strategic vision, Japan had seized control of vast areas in a remarkably short time. For American commanders, the situation was urgent. The balance of power in the Pacific had tilted heavily in Japan's favor, and the threat of further expansion loomed large. If Japan continued its advance unchecked, it could isolate Australia, dominate critical shipping routes, and force the United States into a defensive war with limited options. Yet despite these setbacks, American leadership refused to accept defeat. Behind the scenes, efforts were already underway to understand Japanese strategy, rebuild naval strength, and prepare for the next major confrontation. At the center of this effort was a quiet but critical advantage: intelligence. While Japan relied on speed, coordination, and secrecy, the United States had made significant progress in breaking portions of the Japanese Naval Code, known as JN-25. This breakthrough allowed American analysts to begin piecing together fragments of enemy plans, though the full picture remained unclear. Reports suggested that Japan was preparing a major operation somewhere in the Pacific, targeting a location referred to only as AF. Determining what AF meant became a priority. Without that knowledge, American forces could not position themselves effectively to respond. At Pearl Harbor, intelligence officers worked around the clock, analyzing intercepted messages and trying to anticipate Japan's next move. Among them was Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose team believed that AF referred to Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost northwest of Hawaii. Midway's location made it a key defensive position for the United States, and its loss could open the door to further attacks on Hawaii itself. To confirm their theory, American forces carried out a simple but effective deception. A message was sent from Midway, reporting a shortage of fresh water. Shortly afterward, Japanese communications referenced AF experiencing water shortages. The conclusion was clear: Midway was the target. With this knowledge, the situation changed dramatically. What had seemed like another unpredictable Japanese offensive now became an opportunity. Instead of reacting to an attack, American forces could prepare an ambush. But this opportunity came with enormous risk. The United States Navy still had limited resources in the Pacific. Aircraft carriers, which had become the most important naval assets of the war, were few in number. The loss of even one could significantly weaken American capabilities. Meanwhile, Japan planned to commit a powerful strike force, including multiple carriers and experienced aircrews that had already proven their effectiveness in earlier battles. The coming confrontation would not be evenly matched. American commanders would have to rely on precise timing, coordination, and the element of surprise to stand any chance of success. As preparations began, ships were moved into position, aircraft were readied, and crews were briefed on what lay ahead. In just a matter of days, two naval forces would converge near a remote island in the Pacific. What neither side fully realized was that this encounter would become one of the most decisive battles of the entire war, and that the outcome would reshape the balance of power in ways no one could yet predict. While American forces prepared in secrecy, the Japanese High Command moved forward with a plan designed to eliminate what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, understood that time was no longer on Japan's side. The longer the war continued, the more likely it was that American industrial power would begin to overwhelm Japanese resources. His solution was bold and decisive: draw the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them in a single, overwhelming strike. Midway Atoll was chosen as the bait. By attacking this isolated outpost, Yamamoto believed the United States would be forced to respond, sending its carriers into a carefully prepared ambush. Once those carriers were located, Japanese naval air power would strike quickly and decisively, removing the last major obstacle to Japanese dominance in the Pacific. It was a plan built on precision, timing, and confidence that had been reinforced by months of uninterrupted success. The Japanese fleet, assembled for the operation, was formidable. At its core were 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each carrying experienced pilots who had already proven their effectiveness in earlier campaigns. These carriers were supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a separate invasion force tasked with occupying Midway once resistance had been eliminated. The operation itself was complex, involving multiple groups spread across a wide area of the Pacific. While this allowed Japan to cover more ground, it also introduced risk. Coordination between these forces would be critical, and any delay or miscommunication could disrupt the entire plan. Still, Japanese leadership believed their experience and discipline would ensure success. They expected the Americans to be unprepared, reacting too slowly to mount an effective defense. What they did not know was that their movements were already being tracked, their intentions anticipated, and their advantage of surprise slipping away. On the American side, the situation remained tense and uncertain. Although intelligence had provided a crucial advantage, it did not guarantee victory. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, faced difficult decisions with limited resources. He had only 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had been damaged just weeks earlier during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Repairs on Yorktown were rushed to an extraordinary degree, with crews working around the clock to return the ship to operational status. It was not fully restored, but it was deemed ready enough to fight. Every available aircraft was gathered, every pilot briefed, and every ship positioned with care. Unlike the Japanese, who expected to dictate the terms of the battle, the Americans were preparing to strike at exactly the right moment, if that moment could be found. As both sides moved closer to Midway, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any seen before in naval warfare. This would not be a battle decided by battleships exchanging fire at close range, but by aircraft launched from carriers, striking targets hundreds of kilometers away. Timing would be everything. A delay of minutes could mean the difference between launching an attack or being caught defenseless. Pilots would have to locate enemy fleets across vast stretches of ocean, often with limited information and under intense pressure. Communication would be imperfect. Decisions would have to be made quickly, and mistakes would carry immediate consequences. Both sides believed they understood what was about to happen. Both believed they had the advantage. But as the fleets closed in on Midway, a series of small, unpredictable factors, weather, timing, and human judgment, would begin to shape the battle in ways no plan could fully control. The trap had been set. The question now was, who would walk into it first? By early June 1942, both fleets were moving through the vast Pacific, separated by hundreds of kilometers of open water, each trying to locate the other before being discovered themselves. The scale of the ocean made this an enormous challenge. Unlike land battles, where positions could be fixed and movements tracked, naval warfare at this distance relied heavily on reconnaissance. Aircraft were launched in wide search patterns, scanning the horizon for any sign of enemy ships. Hours could pass without contact, and even when sightings were made, reports were often incomplete or delayed. For the Japanese, the operation was already underway. On the morning of June 4th, aircraft launched from their carriers struck Midway Atoll, targeting airfields and defensive positions. Bombs fell across the island, damaging infrastructure but failing to completely neutralize its defenses. American anti-aircraft fire responded immediately, and surviving aircraft from Midway attempted to strike back, launching a series of uncoordinated attacks against the Japanese fleet. These early efforts were costly and largely ineffective, with many planes shot down before reaching their targets. But they served an important purpose. They confirmed that the Japanese carriers were present, and they forced the enemy to remain engaged, complicating their next move. At the same time, American carriers remained hidden northeast of Midway, waiting for confirmation of the enemy's exact position. Scout planes from the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet spread out across the ocean, searching for the Japanese fleet. The pressure on these reconnaissance missions was immense. A single missed sighting could allow the enemy to strike first. A delayed report could mean launching an attack too late. Hours passed with uncertainty building across the American fleet. Then, shortly after 7 a.m., a breakthrough came. A scout plane reported sighting elements of the Japanese force, including carriers. The message was not perfectly clear, but it was enough. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task force, made a critical decision. Rather than waiting for more complete information, he ordered an immediate launch of attack aircraft. It was a calculated risk. Launching too early meant aircraft might struggle to locate the enemy. Waiting too long could allow the Japanese to strike first. Spruance chose speed over certainty. As American aircraft began taking off from their carriers, another crucial moment was unfolding on the Japanese side. After the initial strike on Midway, Japanese commanders faced a difficult decision. Reports indicated that the island had not been fully neutralized, suggesting that a second strike might be necessary. At the same time, reconnaissance reports hinted at the possible presence of American naval forces in the area. This created uncertainty within the Japanese command structure. Should they prepare another attack on Midway, or shift their focus to locating and engaging American carriers? The decision required careful timing, and even small delays could have significant consequences. Aircraft that had already been armed for one mission would need to be reconfigured for another, a process that took valuable time and created temporary vulnerability on the carrier decks. As orders were debated and preparations adjusted, the Japanese fleet entered a critical window, one where their offensive power was not fully ready and their defenses were not fully organized. Meanwhile, American planes were already in the air, flying low over the ocean in search of their target. Fuel levels, navigation challenges, and the sheer size of the search area created constant tension for the pilots. Some squadrons became separated, others struggled to find the enemy, and coordination between different groups began to break down. Yet, despite these challenges, they continued forward. The outcome of the battle would soon depend on whether these aircraft could locate the Japanese carriers and whether they would arrive at the right moment. Across the Pacific, both sides were now fully committed. The search phase was ending, and the first decisive blows were about to be struck. As the American strike groups pressed forward, the situation in the air became increasingly chaotic. Torpedo squadrons flying low over the ocean were the first to make contact with the Japanese fleet. These slow-moving aircraft, outdated and vulnerable, faced overwhelming resistance as they approached. Japanese fighter planes intercepted them quickly, cutting through the formations with devastating precision. Anti-aircraft fire from the ships below added to the danger, creating a deadly barrier that few could survive. One by one, the American torpedo planes were shot down before they could effectively launch their attacks. Losses were severe. Entire squadrons were nearly wiped out within minutes, and very few torpedoes reached their targets. From a tactical perspective, these attacks achieved little, but their impact on the battle would prove far greater than anyone realized at that moment. By forcing Japanese fighters down to low altitude and drawing their attention away from higher levels, they created an unexpected opening in the fleet's defenses. At the same time, high above the battle, American dive bomber squadrons were still searching for the enemy. Fuel levels were becoming a serious concern, and some pilots were on the verge of turning back. Then, in a moment that would later be seen as one of the most critical turning points of the entire war, the Japanese fleet was located. The carriers below were in the middle of rearming and refueling operations, with aircraft positioned on deck and fuel lines exposed. It was a moment of vulnerability that lasted only a short time, but it was enough. American dive bombers began their descent almost simultaneously, diving steeply toward their targets. Within minutes, the situation changed completely. Bombs struck the decks of the Japanese carriers with devastating effect. Fires erupted, explosions spread rapidly, and the carefully coordinated Japanese strike force began to collapse under the sudden attack. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit in quick succession. The damage was catastrophic. Aircraft on deck ignited, fuel and ammunition detonated, and control of the ships was lost as fires spread beyond containment. What had been the core of Japan's naval power in the Pacific was now burning. Crews fought desperately to control the damage, but the scale of destruction made recovery impossible. In a matter of minutes, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Japanese fleet, which had entered the battle expecting to eliminate American carriers, was now fighting to survive. The speed of the transformation was almost impossible to comprehend. A force that had dominated the Pacific for months had been brought to the brink of collapse in a single, coordinated strike. Yet the battle was not over. One carrier remained operational, Hiryu. Its aircraft had not yet been committed during the earlier chaos, and its command structure remained intact. From Hiryu, a counterattack was launched. Japanese aircraft quickly located the USS Yorktown and moved in to strike. Bombs and torpedoes hit the carrier, causing severe damage and forcing the crew to abandon ship temporarily. For a moment, it appeared that Japan might still be able to recover, inflicting enough damage to balance the losses it had just suffered. The outcome of the battle once again hung in uncertainty. American forces had delivered a devastating blow, but the fight was not finished. With one carrier still active and both sides heavily engaged, the final outcome would depend on what happened next. As smoke continued to rise from the burning Japanese carriers, both sides understood that the battle had entered its final and most critical phase. For Japan, the situation had shifted from calculated offensive to desperate recovery. Hiryu, now the only operational carrier in the strike force, became the last chance to regain control. Its commanders acted quickly, launching another wave of aircraft in an attempt to finish what the earlier attack had started. Their target was clear: the remaining American carriers. If they could destroy them, the balance might still be restored. The pilots flying from Hiryu were among the most experienced in the Japanese Navy, and despite the chaos unfolding around them, they executed their mission with precision. They found Yorktown again, striking it a second time with torpedoes that caused additional flooding and severe structural damage. The carrier, already weakened, was left dead in the water. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Japanese counterattack had succeeded in removing a key American asset from the battle. But while Japan focused on Yorktown, American forces were already preparing their response. Intelligence and reconnaissance quickly identified Hiryu as the last remaining threat. Orders were issued without delay. Aircraft were launched from Enterprise and Hornet, carrying the weight of the battle's outcome with them. Unlike earlier in the day, there was now no uncertainty about the target. The pilots knew exactly what they were looking for and what was at stake. As they approached, they encountered resistance, but the defensive screen around Hiryu was no longer as strong as it had been earlier. The Japanese fleet had been disrupted, coordination weakened, and resources stretched thin. When the American dive bombers began their attack, the result mirrored what had happened just hours before. Bombs struck Hiryu's deck, igniting fires that quickly spread out of control. Efforts to contain the damage failed as explosions ripped through the ship. Within a short time, Hiryu was effectively neutralized. With the destruction of the fourth carrier, the battle reached a decisive turning point. Japan had lost all of its frontline carriers involved in the operation, ships that had formed the core of its naval air power since the beginning of the war. The loss was not only material, but also human. Many of the experienced pilots who had led earlier victories were gone, replaced by a growing gap that could not easily be filled. For the United States, the situation had reversed completely. What had begun as a defensive operation against a superior force had turned into a major victory. Yet even in this moment, the consequences were still unfolding. Yorktown, though heavily damaged, had not yet been lost entirely. Efforts were underway to salvage the ship, and crews returned to assess whether it could be saved. The battle, while decided in terms of carriers, had not fully ended. The ocean still held uncertainty, and the cost of the fighting was still being counted. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, the scale of what had occurred became clearer. In a single day, one of the most powerful naval strike forces ever assembled had been effectively destroyed. The speed and precision of the American response had altered the course of the battle in a way few could have predicted. For Japan, the offensive had failed, not just tactically, but strategically. The goal had been to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific. Instead, that power had been preserved and strengthened. The initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands, was now slipping away. What remained to be seen was how both sides would respond in the days ahead, and how the consequences of this battle would shape the wider war. In the hours following the destruction of the Japanese carriers, the immediate intensity of the battle began to fade, but the danger had not yet passed. The Pacific remained an active battlefield, and both sides were still maneuvering uncertain of what might come next. For American forces, the focus shifted quickly from attack to survival and recovery. The damaged USS Yorktown, though heavily hit, had not sunk. Damage control teams returned aboard, working in dangerous conditions to stabilize the ship. Pumps were activated to control flooding, fires were brought under control, and efforts were made to restore partial functionality. For a brief period, it seemed possible that Yorktown might be saved. Escort ships formed a protective screen around it, guarding against further attacks. But the threat was still present beneath the surface. Japanese submarines operating in the area were searching for opportunities to strike back. The battle above the water may have been decided, but below it, the situation remained uncertain. That uncertainty became reality when a Japanese submarine located the damaged carrier. Torpedoes were launched, cutting through the water toward Yorktown and its escorting vessels. The impact was devastating. The already weakened carrier took additional hits, sealing its fate. Nearby, the destroyer, USS Hammond, was also struck and sunk in the attack. The loss was sudden and violent, a reminder that even after a major victory, the cost of war continued. Yorktown, which had survived both the Battle of the Coral Sea and the intense fighting at Midway, now slowly rolled and sank into the Pacific. For the American sailors who had fought to keep her afloat, it was a difficult end. The ship had played a crucial role in the battle, and its loss carried both strategic and emotional weight. It was a clear reminder that victory at Midway had not come without sacrifice. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet, what remained of it, began to withdraw. With their carrier force destroyed and their offensive plans in ruins, there was no longer any path forward. The invasion of Midway was abandoned, and surviving ships were ordered to retreat. For the first time since the start of the war, Japanese expansion had been decisively stopped. The momentum that had driven their early successes was gone. What remained was the realization that the balance of power had shifted in a way that could not easily be reversed. The loss of 4 carriers, along with the experienced crews that had operated them, created a gap that Japan would struggle to replace. Training new pilots took time, building new ships required resources, and the war would not wait. For the United States, the outcome carried a different meaning. The victory at Midway did not end the war, but it changed its direction. Confidence, which had been shaken after Pearl Harbor, was restored. The ability to challenge and defeat Japanese naval forces had been proven, and future operations could now be planned with a new sense of possibility. The Pacific was still vast, and the fighting ahead would be long and difficult, but the initiative was beginning to shift. Midway marked the moment when the United States moved from reacting to shaping the course of the war. The events that followed would build on that shift, leading to a series of campaigns that would gradually push Japanese forces back across the Pacific. As the battle came to a close, what remained was not just a record of ships lost or victories gained, but a deeper understanding of how quickly war could change. Plans that seemed certain could collapse in hours, advantages could disappear in minutes, and small decisions made under pressure could shape outcomes on a scale far beyond the battlefield. Midway had been a test of intelligence, timing, and execution. It had exposed weaknesses, revealed strengths, and ultimately altered the trajectory of the conflict. The ocean where it had taken place returned to silence, but the impact of what had happened there would continue to be felt long after the smoke had cleared. In the days following the battle, the immediate focus shifted from combat to assessment. Reports began to flow in from across the Pacific, and the scale of what had happened at Midway slowly became clear to both sides. For the United States, the results were beyond what many had believed possible just weeks earlier. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed, along with a large portion of the experienced air crews that had formed the backbone of Japan's naval aviation. These were not easily replaceable losses. Unlike ships, which could eventually be rebuilt, trained pilots required time, experience, and resources that Japan could no longer afford to lose. For American leadership, this realization carried enormous significance. The Japanese Navy had lost not just equipment, but capability. Its ability to project power across the Pacific had been severely weakened in a single engagement. At the same time, efforts were made to secure Midway itself and reinforce its defenses. The island, which had been the intended target of the Japanese operation, remained in American hands. Airfields were repaired, additional personnel were deployed, and preparations were made in case of another attack. But no second strike came. Instead, Japanese forces continued their withdrawal, focusing on preserving what remained of their fleet. The contrast between the two sides was becoming increasingly clear. Where Japan had been forced onto the defensive, the United States was beginning to rebuild momentum. This shift was not immediately visible across the entire Pacific, but it marked the beginning of a longer transition. For the first time since the war had started, American forces were in a position to consider offensive operations rather than simply reacting to enemy movements. Despite the victory, American commanders remained cautious. The war was far from over, and Japanese forces still controlled vast territories across the Pacific. The danger had not disappeared. It had changed form. Future battles would still be costly, and the enemy remained capable of mounting strong resistance. But Midway had altered the psychological balance as much as the strategic one. Confidence within the U.S. Navy grew, supported by the knowledge that careful planning, intelligence, and decisive action could overcome even a powerful and experienced opponent. Lessons from the battle were studied closely. The importance of carrier-based aviation, the role of reconnaissance, and the impact of timing were all reinforced. These insights would shape how future operations were planned and executed. For Japan, the consequences were more difficult to accept. The loss of the carriers disrupted long-term strategy and forced a re-evaluation of priorities. Plans that had relied on continued expansion now had to account for the possibility of sustained resistance from American forces. Resources would need to be redistributed and defensive positions strengthened. But even with these adjustments, the reality was clear. The advantage that Japan had held in the early months of the war was gone. Midway had not ended the conflict, but it had set a new direction, one in which Japan would increasingly struggle to maintain its position while the United States would gradually push forward. The battle had been brief in duration, but its effects would extend far beyond the waters where it had been fought. In the weeks after Midway, the effects of the battle began to spread across the wider Pacific theater. While the immediate fighting had ended, its consequences were now influencing decisions far beyond the site of the battle itself. American commanders, who had spent months reacting to rapid Japanese advances, were now faced with a new possibility: taking the initiative. The question was no longer whether the United States could hold its ground, but where it should strike next. Attention quickly turned to the Solomon Islands, a region where Japanese forces had begun constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal. If completed, that airfield would threaten vital supply routes between the United States and Australia. The situation demanded action. With the momentum gained at Midway, American leadership made a critical decision to launch an offensive operation. It would be the first major ground campaign led by U.S. forces in the Pacific, marking a clear shift from defense to attack. The planning for this operation moved quickly, but it was far from simple. Resources were still limited, and coordination between naval, air, and ground forces required careful preparation. The lessons learned at Midway were already shaping these plans. Intelligence would play a central role, reconnaissance would be prioritized, and timing would be critical. When U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they entered a new phase of the war, one defined by sustained offensives rather than isolated engagements. The fighting there would prove just as intense and complex as anything seen before, with both sides committing significant resources to control the island. For American forces, it was a test of whether the momentum gained at Midway could be translated into long-term strategic success. At the same time, the Japanese military was attempting to respond to the new reality. The loss at Midway had forced adjustments, but it had not eliminated Japan's ability to fight. Reinforcements were sent to the Solomon Islands, and efforts were made to counter the American advance. Naval engagements, air battles, and ground combat would soon converge in the region, creating a prolonged struggle that neither side could easily resolve. Yet beneath these efforts, the effects of Midway continued to shape outcomes. The absence of experienced carrier groups limited Japan's flexibility, and the loss of trained pilots made sustained operations more difficult. What had once been a coordinated and aggressive expansion was now becoming a series of reactive movements, each aimed at holding ground rather than gaining it. For American forces, the shift was equally significant. Confidence gained from Midway translated into more aggressive planning and execution. Commanders began to think not just about stopping the enemy, but about pushing them back across the Pacific. The war was entering a new stage, one where time and resources would increasingly favor the United States. Industrial production was accelerating, new ships were entering service, and training programs were expanding the number of available personnel. The balance that had once seemed firmly in Japan's favor was now beginning to tilt in the opposite direction. Midway had not ended the war, but it had opened the door to a series of events that would define its next phase. The turning point had passed. What followed would determine how far that shift could go. As the impact of Midway continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that the battle had done more than shift momentum. It had changed the nature of naval warfare itself. Before the war, battleships had been considered the dominant force at sea, designed to engage the enemy directly with massive guns at close range, but Midway confirmed what earlier engagements had begun to suggest. Control of the skies had become the deciding factor. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, were now the center of naval power. At Midway, the opposing fleets never saw each other directly. The entire battle was fought through aircraft launched from ships hundreds of kilometers apart. Decisions were made based on reconnaissance reports, timing of launches, and the ability to strike first. It was a new kind of warfare, one where information and speed mattered more than armor and firepower. For both sides, the lessons were immediate and undeniable. American commanders moved quickly to apply these lessons. Training programs were adjusted, emphasizing coordination between carriers, aircraft, and reconnaissance units. The importance of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter cover was reevaluated, with greater focus placed on timing and communication. At the same time, industrial production in the United States began to accelerate at a pace that Japan could not match. New carriers were already under construction, and improvements in aircraft design were being introduced. Midway had provided both the confidence and the clarity needed to move forward with a new strategy, one centered on carrier task forces capable of projecting power across vast distances. Future operations would rely on these principles, combining intelligence, mobility, and air superiority to achieve results that had once seemed impossible. For Japan, the realization was equally significant but far more difficult to act upon. The loss of 4 carriers had not only reduced immediate strength, but also disrupted long-term planning. Replacing those ships would take time, and replacing the experienced crews lost at Midway would take even longer. Training new pilots under wartime conditions proved challenging, and the quality gap between new recruits and seasoned veterans began to widen. While Japan continued to fight with determination the flexibility and coordination that had defined its earlier successes were harder to maintain. Each subsequent operation required more effort, more resources, and carried greater risk. The advantage that had once allowed Japan to dictate the pace of the war was steadily diminishing. Looking back, Midway stands as one of the clearest examples of how quickly the balance of power can change in war. A single battle lasting only a few days had reshaped strategies, redefined priorities, and altered expectations on both sides. It demonstrated that even a well-prepared plan could fail if the enemy anticipated it, and that even a smaller force could achieve decisive results through timing and coordination. The lessons learned at Midway would influence not only the remainder of the Pacific War, but also the future of naval warfare as a whole. It marked the point where the conflict moved beyond traditional doctrines and into a new era, one where control of the air would determine control of the sea. By the end of June 1942, the Battle of Midway had already begun to take its place as one of the most decisive moments of the Second World War. What had started as a carefully planned Japanese offensive had ended in a loss that could not be undone. The destruction of 4 carriers, the loss of experienced aircrews, and the failure to capture Midway itself marked a turning point that went far beyond a single battle. For Japan, it was the moment where expansion reached its limit. The strategy that had relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force could no longer deliver the same results. The initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands, had been broken. Even though fighting would continue across the Pacific for years to come, the direction of the war had changed. The question was no longer whether Japan could expand further, but how long it could hold what it had already taken. For the United States, Midway represented something equally important: proof. After the shock of Pearl Harbor and the rapid Japanese advances that followed, there had been uncertainty about how long it would take to recover. Midway answered that question. It showed that American forces could not only defend themselves, but also defeat a powerful and experienced enemy. That confidence would carry forward into every operation that followed. From Guadalcanal to the Central Pacific campaigns, the approach remained consistent: use intelligence, strike with precision, and maintain pressure over time. The victory at Midway did not guarantee success, but it made it possible. It created the conditions under which future victories could be achieved. What makes Midway stand out is not just the scale of destruction, but the speed at which everything changed. Within a few hours, on June 4th, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted. A fleet that had dominated for months was reduced to burning wreckage, and a force that had been on the defensive suddenly gained the initiative. These moments in war are rare. They do not come from a single factor, but from a combination of preparation, timing, and decision-making under pressure. At Midway, all of those elements came together at exactly the right moment. Small decisions, when to launch aircraft, how to interpret incomplete information, whether to wait or act, had consequences far beyond what anyone involved could have predicted at the time. In the years that followed, the battle would be studied, analyzed, and remembered as a defining example of how wars can turn on a single engagement. For historians, it became a case study in intelligence, leadership, and the role of chance. For those who fought there, it remained something more personal, a moment where survival, duty, and uncertainty came together in a way that few could fully describe. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unchanged on the surface, had witnessed an event that reshaped the course of the war. Midway was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance in the Pacific, and from that point forward, the path toward Allied victory, though still long and difficult, had become clear.